I didn't expect anything unusual when I took the job. A routine service call, a faulty water heater, and a house that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in a while. But by the end of the week, I had come face to face with a quiet kind of loneliness I wasn't prepared for, and the kind of connection that doesn't announce itself with sparks or grand gestures, but with silence, patience, and understanding. I went in to fix something mechanical, but something in me, maybe something in both of us, got fixed too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The job came through an old client who ran a local hardware store out in Charleston. A woman had come in looking for someone to check on her water heater, said it kept giving out on cold mornings. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The man who used to handle repairs for her had moved away, and she didn't really know who to call. I didn't have much on my plate that week, so I figured why not. He gave me her address, told me she lived a little outside town in a small ranch-style home near the edge of the woods, kind of secluded, but not far off the main road. Her name was Julia. It was mid-March, and the weather hadn't made up its mind yet. Cloudy mornings, cool afternoons, and the occasional warm breeze that reminded you spring was close. I remember the first time I pulled up her driveway. The house was neat, but quiet, like it was waiting. The porch had a couple of ceramic flower pots that hadn't seen fresh soil in a long time, and the wooden swing off to the side creaked slightly. In the wind, there was something about it that felt paused, like someone had pressed a button on their life a few years back and never hit play again. I knocked, and after a few seconds, the door opened just enough for me to see her face. She looked at me carefully, as if trying to remember if she'd asked for help at all. Julia wasn't old. Not by any means 48. I'd learn later, but her expression carried a tiredness I couldn't place. Navy sweater and loose jeans, barefoot, and holding a folded dish towel in her hand, like it gave her something to do. "You're here for the heater?" she asked. Not cold, but not warm either. I nodded, held up my toolbox, said I'd take a quick look and wouldn't be in the way. She let me in and pointed toward the hallway where the utility closet was. The inside of her home matched the outside, clean, quiet, and somehow still. A picture frame here and there, a thin layer of dust on the bookshelves, no clutter, but no signs of daily life either. I couldn't hear a TV or music, just the occasional tick of an old clock in the living room. It reminded me of a library, peaceful, but maybe a little too peaceful. The water heater was clearly old, likely original to the house. Had some corrosion around the base, and wasn't holding heat efficiently. I knelt down and started running. A few diagnostics, my hands working automatically. I've done this job for almost a decade, and most of it is muscle memory by now. But I couldn't help noticing how quiet it was behind me. I assumed she'd gone back to the kitchen or the living room, but when I turned to ask her a question, she was standing at the edge of the hallway watching. Not in a creepy way, just kind of there. She realized I noticed and took a step back, apologizing quickly and telling me she'd make some tea if I wanted any. I said sure, mostly just to fill the silence. I think we were both trying to figure out what to do with the awkwardness between us, like strangers sharing an elevator ride that was taking a bit too long. A few minutes later, she brought over a cup and placed it gently on the floor next to my bag, careful not to interrupt whatever I was doing. She didn't say anything else, just returned to wherever she came from. The repair would take more than one day. The parts needed ordering, and the sediment buildup inside the tank meant a deeper flush was necessary. I told her as much, and she just nodded, like she'd expected that all along. As I packed up for the day, she stood by the door. Holding it open with one hand, I said goodbye, and she gave me a small, almost invisible smile. That was the first day I drove home that night thinking about her, not in a romantic way, not yet. It's just about how someone could seem so present and absent at the same time. It's like she was standing in her own house but didn't live there. Worked with a lot of clients over the years, some chatty, some rude, some grateful. Julia was different. She was polite, quiet, and completely unreadable. And for some reason, that stuck with me. The next morning, before I even rang the bell, she opened the door as I stepped onto the porch. She said she figured I'd be by early, This time her hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she wore a flannel shirt over a tank top. There was something about how she stood in the doorway, like she was bracing herself for something she didn't fully understand. I told her I had the parts in the truck and it shouldn't take more than a couple of hours. She nodded and stepped aside without a word. As I got to work again, she disappeared into the kitchen. But every now and then, I'd hear the sound of cabinets opening or a chair creaking and knew she was nearby. I didn't mind. I've worked in silence for years, but something about this silence felt shared. About 40 minutes in, I heard her voice from behind me. She asked if I liked grilled cheese. I turned around and saw her holding up a pan, a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. I nodded, and she disappeared again. A few minutes later, she placed a plate near the wall by the heater and said, "Lunch, if you're hungry." Then she went back down the hall without waiting for a response. That moment, small and unremarkable as it was, felt like the first thread of a very long conversation we hadn't started yet. I ate the sandwich sitting cross-legged on the utility room floor, the plate resting on top of my closed toolbox. It was just bread and cheese, lightly toasted with a bit of butter, but it felt like something more, not because of the taste, though it was good, but because of the gesture behind it. Julia didn't strike me as someone who offered food to every stranger who came to fix something in her house. It felt deliberate in its simplicity, like an olive branch extended without ceremony. I finished eating in silence, then got back to work, draining what was left in the tank and prepping the area for installation of the new part. She didn't come back again until I was already cleaning up for the day, coiling wires and wiping tools. She hovered by the hallway like she had something to say but couldn't quite say it. I gave her a brief rundown of what had been done, what was still left, and when I'd be back. She thanked me, her voice lower this time, softer. Then she asked if I needed anything for the road, a bottle of water, maybe? I shook my head, told her I was good, and for the first time, she looked me in the eye a few seconds longer than necessary. I didn't think much of it then, just a moment. But it stayed with me longer than it should have. On the third day, I arrived a little earlier. Something about the job felt less like an obligation and more like a reason to come back. The heater was close to being fixed, but I'd spaced the final tasks out over 2 days. Not out of laziness. Just something instinctual told me not to rush it. When I knocked this time, she opened the door wearing an apron over her clothes. I could smell something sweet baking from inside. Cinnamon or nutmeg maybe, and the house felt warmer than before, not just because the water heater was half working again. She said she figured I'd be hungry and pointed toward the kitchen. I hesitated, confused for a second, but she said she had made muffins and would wrap a few for me to take later if I wanted. I said thank you, surprised by the change. The woman, who could barely look at me 2 days ago, was now offering muffins before I'd even stepped inside. Something was shifting. That day we ended up talking more. Not in big ways, no dramatic stories or heavy confessions, but in small exchanges that filled the silence between tool clicks and pipe tightening. She asked where I was from, how long I'd been doing this kind of work. I told her about my start as an apprentice in a bigger firm, how I eventually went solo, how I liked the quiet of small jobs and honest labor. She nodded, and for the first time, she offered something back. She used to teach at a local elementary school. Art, mostly. Retired early after some family changes. She didn't go into details, and I didn't ask. But I noticed how her fingers lingered over the edge of the kitchen counter when she talked about it. Like memory was something she could physically feel. We talked about Charleston tooth-aparts. That had changed, the ones that stayed the same. We joked about the traffic, the way the town still had that old soul charm even though the strip malls kept growing like weeds. At one point she asked me if I ever got bored doing this kind of work, just going house to house fixing broken things. I told her it wasn't about the broken things. It was about the people who lived around them. She didn't say anything, right? Away. But I saw her smile, the first real one, flicker across her face like a shadow catching light. I finished earlier than expected that day, but I didn't leave right away. We ended up on the back porch for a bit. She brought out 2 glasses of iced tea and sat down in a creaky metal chair, her knees tucked under a blanket, even though it Wasn't that cold? Stood leaning against the railing at first, then eventually pulled over one of the old chairs and joined her. We didn't talk much. The wind moved through the trees behind her house, and a pair of crows argued in the branches. Wasn't uncomfortable, that silence. It was restful. Like both of us had been waiting to sit still with someone without. Needing to explain why, she told me that the house had been her parents' before it became hers. They'd both passed within a year of each other. Her husband had been gone for nearly 6 years now. Not dead, just gone. Walked out with a bag in one hand and a scowl in the other. Said he needed something else. She never stopped him. I didn't. Ask why. I didn't need to. The way she said it made it clear she'd asked herself that question enough for both of us. There was a pause after that. One that lasted just long enough to carry weight. She looked at her hands in her lap then. Back up at me and said she didn't think she'd ever planned on calling someone to fix the heater. That maybe she could have kept living with it half working. That maybe it wasn't about the heater at all. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and said I was glad she called anyway. She didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning, I got a call from her. Not an email, but a real call. She said the hot water was running fine, but that the pressure had dropped in the guest bathroom, and maybe I could take a look. I could. Tell from her tone that it wasn't urgent, maybe not even real. But I said yes anyway. I rearranged my schedule and showed up an hour later. This time, when she opened the door, she looked different. Not dressed up, not made up, just present. Like the lights inside her had been switched on a little more. I got to work quickly, checking the fixtures, running pressure tests, flushing lines. All things I could have done blindfolded, but I took my time. She offered coffee this time instead of tea, and I said yes. Not because I needed it, but because I didn't want her to go. At one point, as I leaned under the sink in the hallway bathroom, I heard her footsteps approaching. I expected her to ask how long it would take, or if it was a serious issue. Instead, she said something else entirely. I almost didn't catch it the first time. Her voice was quiet. It's almost like she wasn't even sure she'd spoken aloud. I'm 48, she said, and I turned slightly to look at her. She wasn't looking at me, though. She was looking down the hallway, past the bathroom, towards something invisible. I'm 48, and I haven't been touched in years. Then she turned and walked away. I sat there for a few seconds, wrenched still. In hand, the water turned off, my mouth suddenly dry. I hadn't expected that. Not here, not from her. Not like that. I stayed there for a long moment, staring at the pipes beneath the sink and wondering what kind of pain you have to carry for words like that to slip out of you without warning. I stayed crouched under that sink for longer than I probably should have, the silence folding around me like a second skin. The pipes were fixed, the water was running fine, and yet I didn't move. Birds, just a handful of them, cooed through the narrow hallway, louder than any scream could. I'm 48 and I haven't been touched in years. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. There wasn't any sadness in her voice, not even shame. It was something else entirely. Truth spoken aloud after being buried so long it had lost its weight, like dust blown off an old photo. She hadn't said it to provoke or invite. She hadn't even really said it to me. She said it to the house, to the walls, to herself. I wasn't sure if she remembered I was even there. Eventually, I stood, wiped my hands with a rag, and checked everything one more time. When I stepped out of the bathroom, the hallway was empty. The air felt heavier. I could hear the quiet clink of a teacup on a saucer from the kitchen. She was sitting at the small table by the window, her back straight, eyes focused on the trees. Outside, the same flannel shirt she wore earlier was draped over her shoulders now like a shawl. I didn't want to startle her, so I cleared my throat gently and told her everything checked out and the pressure was normal again. She turned slightly, nodded, and thanked me. Then she said she'd transfer the payment later and asked if I wanted more coffee. I said no, and she said okay, her eyes never leaving the window. I left shortly after. The ride home felt different. like I'd driven through something intangible and couldn't shake the feeling of it clinging to my skin. The roads I knew by heart felt unfamiliar. I kept hearing her voice in my head, not just the words, but the weight behind them. They weren't about romance or need. They were about existence, about the human desire to be seen, to be felt, to matter in a physical world. Loneliness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it waits in kitchens and echoes down empty hallways. I didn't hear from Julia for 3 days. No calls, no texts. I didn't reach out either. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure if she wanted space, if she regretted saying it, or if it was never meant to be acknowledged in the first place. I went about my work, kept busy with other jobs, but she stayed on my mind. Every clink of a teacup in another house, every quiet sigh from an unseen room reminded me of her. I wondered how many people carried similar confessions, unsaid and heavy, tucked behind closed doors and polite smiles. On the 4th day, my phone buzzed. Just after 10 a.m., it was a message. From her. Not long, just a few lines. The water's fine, but I think I made things weird. I'm sorry, you don't have to come back. I just wanted to say that. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. You didn't make anything weird. I'll be in your area tomorrow if you need anything. No pressure. She didn't respond right away. In fact, she didn't respond at all that day. But the next morning, there was a note slipped under my door. I knew it was from her before I even picked it up. The handwriting was small, neat, deliberate. It simply said, "If you're passing by, the porch light's on." That afternoon, I stopped by her place. Not for work. There wasn't anything left to fix. I brought a small container of homemade soup I'd made the night before. My grandmother's recipe. It was the only dish I knew how to make that didn't require exact measurements. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been waiting behind it the whole time. She saw the container in my hand, looked surprised, and stepped aside. Without a word, we sat at the same kitchen table. She poured tea. I ladled soup into mismatched bowls. Didn't say much at first. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It had become something else, a kind of mutual understanding that not every connection needs words to survive. She eventually asked about my day, and I told her about a stubborn valve I'd spent an hour wrestling with. She laughed, not a big laugh, but real. I asked how she was feeling, and she shrugged. I said some days were heavier than others. I didn't press as the sun dipped behind the trees outside. Casting the kitchen in a warm golden hue, she finally spoke again in that same low, steady voice she'd used in the hallway. "You probably think I'm strange," she said. I shook my head and told her I didn't, that I'd met all kinds of people in this line of work, loud ones, shy ones, angry ones, lonely ones, and that none of them ever stuck with me like she had. She looked down at her cup, fingers tightening slightly around the handle. "I didn't mean for it to come out like that," she whispered. That day, I didn't even know I was going to say it until it was already in the air. Told her it was okay, that sometimes the things we bury come up without warning. She nodded, still staring into her cup. "It wasn't about wanting something," she said, pausing. "It was just a fact. Like saying I haven't seen snow in 10 years. Not about longing, it's about noticing what's missing." That line sat between us like a third presence in the room. Not about longing, about noticing. I'd never thought about it that way. I told her I understood, or at least I was trying to, and I meant it. We sat in silence again after that, the soup gone, the tea cold, the kitchen darkening with the sky. She lit a candle on the table and said she didn't like turning on the overhead lights when it got late. Said they were too bright, too harsh. I watched the flame flicker between us and thought about how soft the shadows made her look, how much of herself she had unknowingly revealed in the past few days. Not in words, but in moments. In the way she held things, the pauses in her sentences, the careful way she arranged every item on her shelves. I left not long after. She walked me to the door and stood in the frame as I stepped onto the porch. I turned back and thanked her for the tea. She nodded, her arms folded gently across her chest. As I reached my truck, she called out softly. "Hey," she said, almost as an afterthought. "I'm glad you didn't let it be weird." I smiled, nodded once, and got in without another word. That night I didn't sleep much, not because something was wrong, because something was beginning. I just didn't know what yet. The days that followed didn't carry any grand declarations or dramatic shifts, but they held something subtler, something steady. I didn't rush back to Julia's house with an excuse to check the heater or inspect a faucet I already knew was fine. Instead, I let the silence stretch. It wasn't a silence born of fear or avoidance, just the kind that needed space to grow. But during those few days, I found myself driving past her road without meaning to, slowing near her street like some part of me was making sure the porch light was still on. It usually was. Then one evening, 4 days after our quiet candlelit conversation in her kitchen, I received a message. Not a text this time, but a voicemail. Her voice was calm, as always, but a little lighter, like the words were walking barefoot across a wooden floor. She said she had sorted through a few things in the attic and found an old space heater she didn't need anymore. Maybe I'd want to take a look at it. She laughed quietly and added, or maybe I just want to make sure you're still in the area. I didn't wait a full hour before driving over. When she opened the door, her hair was tied back loosely with a scarf, and her hands were dusted with specks of something, maybe flour, maybe insulation from the attic. She looked at me like I was expected, not in a forced or rehearsed way, but like she had kept a part of her evening open, just in case I showed up. The space heater was sitting on the floor of the living room. It's an old boxy model that probably hadn't been plugged in for years. I picked it up, gave it a shake, and told her I'd take it home and see what I could do. She nodded, barely looking at it. I set it down again and told her I wasn't really there for the heater. Not entirely. She smiled at that. Just a small curve of her mouth, but it felt like the kind of smile you give when someone calls your bluff gently. She asked if I wanted to stay for dinner, said she'd made too much soup again. I accepted without hesitation. It wasn't just about the food, though the soup was good. It was about the table, the candle, the quiet warmth that now lingered in her home. The more I returned, the more the house itself seemed to come alive. The porch swing no longer creaked alone in the wind. The flower pots had been cleaned and refilled with fresh soil and early spring bulbs. I noticed a stack of library books on her coffee table, all fiction, mostly romance and literary drama. The same shelves that had once collected dust now held fresh fingerprints. Like she had been sifting through memories and making space for something new. We talked more that evening, slower and more openly than before. She told me about her brother, who lived up north and rarely called. About her favorite movie growing up, a black and white French film she watched every year on her birthday. She said she stopped watching it after her divorce, not because she stopped liking it, but because it reminded her of a version of herself she didn't feel connected to anymore. I listened, not offering solutions, just presence. That seemed to be enough. At one point I noticed a framed photo turned face down on her bookshelf. I didn't ask, but she saw me glance at it and volunteered the answer anyway. It was of her and her ex-husband, taken on a beach vacation years ago. She said she'd meant to throw it away after he left, but never did. Now she just kept it face down. Out of anger, but because she didn't feel the need to keep remembering something that wasn't alive anymore. I told her I understood, and I did. As the night drew on, I ended up helping her carry a few boxes back to the attic. She apologized for asking, said she usually did it alone, but thought maybe it was okay to let someone else lift the weight this time, both literal and otherwise. We made small talk as we climbed the narrow wooden ladder, the attic warm and musty with the smell of old books and fabric. She pointed out a few things she hadn't looked at in years, a box of letters from college, her mother's old quilt, a stack of vinyl records from a high school boyfriend. We didn't open any of it. Oh, just stood there a while, quiet under the low ceiling, like we'd found a pocket of time untouched by the outside world. Later, as I was getting ready to leave, she walked me out to the porch. The air was crisp, the sky clear with stars just starting to emerge. She stood next to me in silence for a moment, then turned and looked up. You know what's strange? I thought I was done needing people. I thought I'd built this whole life around being okay alone. But then you showed up to fix a water heater and I started baking again. Started sitting on the porch, started talking, didn't respond right away. There didn't seem to be a perfect response, so I said, the only thing that felt true in The moment I told her people aren't pipes or broken parts. They don't get fixed in a day or with a single tool. But sometimes they do need someone to show up with a wrench and a quiet presence and remind them that warmth is still possible. She laughed softly, shook her head. "You always sound like you're about to write a novel," she said. I smiled and told her I wasn't much of a writer, just a guy who's seen enough cold homes to know when one's starting to warm up again. We stood there another few minutes, neither of us making a move to leave or go back inside. Eventually, she stepped back toward the door and said she should get some sleep. I nodded, told her I'd see her soon, and turned to head down the steps. But just before I reached the truck, I heard her voice again, quiet, almost like a question. She wasn't sure she wanted answered. "Do you ever think people come back to life slowly? Not all at once, just little pieces at a time." I looked back at her standing in the doorway, the porch light casting a soft glow around her. "All the time," I said. "All the time." I drove home that night with the windows half down and the radio off. The cool wind felt good on my face, and my hands gripped the wheel like I was steering into something I hadn't expected to find this year. I didn't know what this was, me and Julia, but I knew it mattered. And sometimes, that's enough to keep going back. The next few weeks slipped by in a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. I didn't keep track of how often I saw Juliet wasn't every day, yet somehow it was often enough that I stopped noticing the gaps. Sometimes I'd stop by with no reason at all, other than to return a book she hadn't lent me or drop off leftovers I claimed were too much for me to eat alone. She'd meet me at the door with a soft smile and a raised brow, never calling me out for the obvious excuses, just accepting them with a kind of quiet gratitude that never needed to be spoken aloud. Her house began to change too, not dramatically, but in the small, significant ways that said life was beginning to move again inside its walls. New plants appeared on the windowsills. A fresh coat of soft green paint covered the once faded shutters outside. She mentioned wanting to rearrange the furniture in the guest room and asked what I thought about putting a reading chair near the window. I offered to help move things around, and she let me. She had this way of filling space now, not just physically, but emotionally, like she was becoming more herself with every passing day. The hesitant pauses in her words began to fade, and her laughter came quicker, unguarded. I noticed she touched her hair more when she was thinking, and sometimes when she was speaking, her hands would lift, as if painting pictures in the air. We had fallen into something that wasn't exactly defined, but it felt like home. Not in a romantic, sweeping way, but in the way that mattered, more solid, quiet, real. One Saturday afternoon, she invited me to a local craft fair. It wasn't something I'd usually go to, but the way she asked, like it wasn't just an event, but an invitation into her world, made it impossible to decline. She wore a faded denim jacket over a yellow sundress, and it tucked a tiny flower. Behind her ear, I told her she looked radiant, and she laughed, pretending to swat the compliment away. But her cheeks flushed a warm pink that lingered well into the afternoon. The fair was crowded with stalls and people, the smell of kettle, corn, and cinnamon hanging in the air. Julia seemed in her element, walking slowly between booths, pausing to admire hand-painted mugs and embroidered pillows. She bought a small ceramic bird for her windowsill and a jar of lavender honey. I watched her move, her fingers trailing, over fabrics and glass like she was remembering how to feel textures again. At one booth, she stopped to look at handmade journals bound in leather, their pages uneven and raw. She picked one up, ran her hand along its spine, and said it reminded her of the kind she used to keep in college. Bought it for her when she wasn't looking and slipped it into her tote bag later. That night, when she found it, she texted me a single word, "Thank you," followed by a photo of the journal resting on her nightstand. The weather warmed as spring deepened, and Julia began leaving her windows open during the day. I'd sometimes arrive and hear music floating from the living room, soft instrumental pieces, mostly piano or acoustic guitar. She told me it helped her feel less alone, told her it sounded like the house was breathing again. One afternoon, I brought over a folding ladder and helped her hang a few wind chimes under the back porch eaves. As they clinked in the breeze, she leaned against the railing beside me and said she never thought she'd care about something as small as the sound of chimes again. But now, she said, it felt like permission to listen for beautiful things. We sat there for a long time, watching the wind move through the trees. She talked about her garden plans for summer, about maybe painting the bedroom. At one point, she turned toward me, resting her elbow on the railing, and asked something so unexpected, I nearly dropped the wrench I'd been fiddling with. "Do you think people can start over?" She said, even when they're already halfway through life. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because hers wasn't a question meant for logic. It was about belief. I told her I thought starting over wasn't about wiping the slate clean. It was about continuing the story with new ink. That what came before mattered, but what came next mattered more. She didn't reply, but her eyes shimmered in a way that made me look away. Just to give her that moment to feel whatever it was she needed to feel. Later that night, as I packed up my tools and headed to my truck, she stood in the doorway again, watching me leave, like always. But this time, she didn't say goodbye. Instead, she said, "Be safe getting home, and then let me know when you get there." It was the kind of request people make when they've begun to care more than they want to admit. I drove home. In the dimming light, my hands loose on the steering wheel, thinking about how strange and gentle this had all become. What started as a routine call to fix a broken appliance had unraveled into something layered and human. I thought about the first time I saw her, how guarded she had been, how small her voice was. And now here she was, leaving her porch light. On without apology, inviting life back in, like a friend who'd been away too long. That night, I sent her a message when I got home. "Made it. Thanks for the evening," she replied within seconds. "Thanks for staying," that was all, but it said more than either of us probably realized. The next day I received another message from her, this one longer. She'd been thinking about repainting her bedroom walls a deep ocean blue, and did I know anything about color theory? I told her I didn't, but I knew how to paint. She asked if I had time later in the week. I cleared my schedule. It wasn't about the walls. We both knew that. It was about building something layer by layer. Not rushing, not forcing it into a shape, just showing up. Letting presence do what words couldn't. There was no rush. Had time. Wednesday arrived with a softness to the air that made everything feel suspended. Like the world had paused for a moment to let people breathe a little easier. I packed up my painting supplies, rollers, trays, drop cloths, a few brushes. I kept in an old metal tin with dents in the corners and headed toward Julia's house. She had already texted me that morning, letting me know she'd moved the furniture out of the way and picked up the paint we talked about. "It looks darker in the can," she'd written, "but I think it'll feel like a deep breath once." It's on the walls. I didn't ask her what that meant. I just told her I was on my way. When I pulled into the driveway, the front door was open, the screen closed, and I could hear the faint hum of music inside. Something slow, melodic. I knocked anyway, and she called out for me to come in. The house smelled faintly of fresh coffee and cinnamon, and when I walked into the bedroom, I saw she'd already lined the baseboards with painter's tape. A folded stack of old sheets sat in the corner, along with 2 mugs and a plate of buttered toast. She was barefoot, wearing paint-splattered sweatpants and a tank top. Her hair pulled up messily with a pencil stuck through it like a pin. "You weren't kidding," said, looking at the can of paint she'd left open. The blue was deep and rich, almost navy with a hint of teal when the light hit it right. She shrugged. "Figured if I'm going to start over, I might as well do it in a color that feels like the ocean." We worked in tandem. No instructions. Needed. I laid the drop cloth while she stirred the paint. We moved around each other like we'd done this before. Not just the task, but the closeness. There was something sacred about painting a room with someone. It wasn't just labor. It was change in motion, commitment to transformation, even if it was just for the sake of color. The first stroke across the wall was almost meditative. Julia watched the roller move with quiet focus, and then picked up her own brush to begin edging the corners. We didn't talk much during the process. The silence wasn't heavy, though. It was the kind of silence you share when you're both thinking about the same thing, but not quite ready to say it aloud. Occasionally, one of us would hum along to the music, or make a quiet observation about how the color looked different on each wall, depending on the light. Around noon, we took a break, sat on the floor with our backs against the opposite wall, sipped coffee from mismatched mugs. She asked me about the first house I ever painted, and I told her it belonged. To an elderly woman named Ida who made me a sandwich every day for a week straight while I painted her kitchen and sunroom. I told her about the little stories Ida shared. How she once hid her late husband's ashes in the cookie jar because she didn't trust the urn, and how she used to leave handwritten jokes taped to the ladder each morning. Julia laughed at that. The kind of laugh that lifts a room and settles in your bones. I asked her if she had ever painted a room before, and she said no, not really, not since she was a teenager helping her dad. But she liked the feeling of it, the physical proof that something was changing. When we got back to work, air between us had softened even more. I started noticing the little things, how she bit the inside of her cheek when concentrating, how she stretched her back every 30 minutes, how she didn't mind getting paint on her arms or hands. She moved with a kind of purpose that came from rediscovering control. She wasn't fixing something broken. She was choosing something better. By late afternoon, we'd finished the second coat and were both streaked with paint. She had a smudge on her forehead that she didn't notice, and I didn't tell her. I liked seeing her that way, unguarded mid-transition, vibrant in her own quiet way. The bedroom looked entirely different. The blue was deep and calming, the kind of color that seemed to absorb the noise from the world outside. Julia stood in the doorway and just stared at it for a long moment. "It doesn't feel like the same room," she said, "but in a good way." We cleaned up slowly, still not saying much. I could tell she was sitting with something in emotion maybe, or a memory stirred by the day. As I gathered the brushes, she reached out and gently touched my arm, stopping me. "Can I ask you something?" she said, not looking at me. I nodded. "Of course." She hesitated, then said, "Do you think it's possible to feel comfortable and afraid at the same time?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at her, at the way her eyes held the question like it was heavier than she could carry alone. I told her yes, absolutely. That sometimes fear shows up exactly when comfort arrives, because we're not used to it. That feeling safe can feel dangerous when you've spent years preparing to be hurt. She let out a shaky breath. That's exactly it. We sat on the edge of the bed frame, the mattress still propped against the hallway wall. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock from the living room. She leaned into my shoulder slightly, just enough to let me know she was there. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "Neither do I," said. "But it doesn't have to be anything yet." She looked up at me then, and there was something vulnerable and honest in her gaze, like she was letting me see her without the filters or the guards. No makeup, no polished lines, just Julia as she was in that moment. Human, flawed, brave. "I haven't let someone this close in a long time," she said. "Not even physically. It's not about intimacy or romance, just proximity. Being near someone." "I know," I said. "You don't have to explain it." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for not rushing me. You set the pace," I told her. We didn't touch again that night, not beyond the soft lean of her shoulder. There was no kiss, no confession of love, just an unspoken agreement to stay in this moment a while longer. We ordered takeout and ate on the floor of the freshly painted bedroom. Let me choose the music this time. Pick something quiet. Instrumental, the kind of background melody that wraps around the room like a blanket. When I finally left, it was almost midnight. The air was cool, and the moon hung low and full above the trees. As I stepped outside, she followed me to the porch. She stood barefoot on the wooden boards, arms crossed against the chill. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For making the room feel like a fresh start." I smiled. "You already did that. I just held the roller." She laughed softly. I walked down the steps, and just before I reached the truck, she called out, "Roman." I turned. "You were right. It does feel like a deep breath." I nodded once and drove home with paint on my hands, the scent of lavender still clinging to my shirt, a feeling in my chest I couldn't quite name, but didn't want to lose. The next time I saw her was 3 days later, and I'll admit, I missed her more than I expected to in that short span of time. Not just missed the comfort of her home or the conversations over coffee, but her. In the quiet, unexplainable way, someone becomes part of your everyday thoughts without fanfare. I had been keeping busy with other jobs in nearby neighborhoods, But every evening, I'd find myself slowing down near her street, resisting the impulse to turn in. I didn't want to crowd her. What we were building felt delicate, not fragile, but tender in the way new growth always is. Sometimes the best way to let something deepen is to give it room to breathe. She ended up being the one to reach out. First, with a photo message. It was a picture of her newly painted bedroom with sunlight pouring in through the window. The caption underneath read, "Woke up feeling like the walls were hugging me. You were right about the color." I didn't reply right away. I just stared at the image for a while, that particular kind of stillness flooding over me. Then I wrote back, glad to hear the room approves of its new tenant. She sent a laughing emoji and said she was thinking of tackling her garden next, but she needed a partner in crime if I wasn't too busy. I told her I'd bring my gloves by the time I arrived on Saturday morning. She was already outside, standing on the edge of her small backyard plot with a pair of gardening shears and a notebook. The sun caught her hair in a way that made it look a shade lighter, and she wore a loose button-up shirt rolled to the elbows. Her jeans smudged with soil from an early start. She had drawn a rough layout of where she wanted to plant new flowers, herbs, and maybe a small vegetable patch. It was ambitious but hopeful, just like her. We spent the better part of the day clearing out weeds, turning the soil, and removing old, broken planters. The work was physical, but not exhausting. It was the kind of labor that gave you a sense of accomplishment with each passing hour. Julia moved with more energy than I expected, occasionally pausing to take notes in her little garden book, or to show me some old ceramic labels she had saved from a flea market years ago. There was a moment just after noon when she brushed a strand of hair from her face and looked up at me with dirt-smudged cheeks. And something about her expression content, focused, just a little mischievous, made me pause. She looked alive. Not in the general, of course she's breathing way, but in the deep, glowing way that comes from someone finding joy in their own hands again. We broke for lunch and sat on the edge of the porch steps with sandwiches and lemonade. She told me stories about her childhood summers spent at her grandmother's farm, how they'd rise at dawn, water plants by hand, and pick tomatoes straight from the vine, she said. She forgot how much she missed dirt under her fingernails. I told her I never imagined I'd be spending a Saturday planting basil and talking about compost with someone I met through a busted water heater. And she grinned. "Life's weird," she said, "but in the good way sometimes." After lunch, we started placing the new plants in rose lavender, rosemary, a couple of tomato vines, and some marigolds for color. She was particular about spacing and symmetry, which I teased her about, and she rolled her eyes and called me chaotic. I countered that chaos had its charm. The truth was, I loved watching her care. She didn't just want a garden, she wanted something that thrived because she put love into it. And that, in a way, was what she was doing with her entire life. By late afternoon, the garden had taken shape. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it had structure, intention, and her touch in every corner. She stood at the edge of the yard, hands on her hips, surveying the space like an artist finishing a sketch. I watched her quietly, letting the silence between us settle into something familiar. When she turned to me, her voice was softer than before. "You make it feel easier, you know? Just ... doing things. Like I can try without worrying I'll mess everything up." I leaned against the post beside her and said, "You don't need me to try, but I'm glad to be here while you do." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing that. Then her eyes drifted toward the house. "I've been sleeping better lately," she said. "Not because I'm less tired, but because I'm not lying awake dreading tomorrow. It's a different kind of quiet now. There's something deeply vulnerable in that confession. Not dramatic, but honest." I thought about how many nights she must have stared at her ceiling, listening to silence that didn't soothe but suffocated. How even the warmth of blankets can feel cold when you've forgotten what comfort means. We sat side by side on the back porch as the light began to shift, casting long shadows across the yard. She told me about a dream she'd had the night before, nothing wild or fantastical. Just a simple dream where she was laughing in a kitchen full of people. Sunlight streaming through windows, the smell of bread in the air. She didn't recognize the faces, but she remembered feeling safe. I think that's what I want. she said, her voice barely louder than the breeze. Not a relationship or a label. It's just that feeling, being safe, being seen.
I looked at
her and said, "You're allowed to want that. You deserve that." Her eyes met mine, and there was a long pause. It's the kind where 1,000 things almost get said but don't need to be. Then she reached out and gently squeezed my hand, not in a romantic way, not asking for more, but as a thank you, a gesture of grounding, of presence. That night I didn't stay long. We both felt the weight of the day, not from the labor, but from the softness of it, the kind that leaves you quietly full. Walked me to the front steps, and I paused. Before leaving, "Hey," I said, "when you first told me you hadn't been touched in years, I didn't know what to say. But now I think I get it. It wasn't about desire or longing. It was about connection. Real, human connection." She nodded, her eyes steady. "Yeah, it was never about the touch itself. It was about what came with it: intimacy, intention. Someone reaching out without needing something in return." I smiled. "Well, if we're keeping score, I think the marigolds liked your touch just fine." She laughed then, that same melodic laugh that had begun to color my days, and said, "They better." I talked to them more than I talked to most people last year. I drove home that evening with dirt still under my fingernails and a strange sense of peace in my chest. I didn't know where this road with Julia was leading. There were no promises, no mapped-out endings. But there was something real here, something honest and slowly growing, rooted in respect and steady presence. For now, that was more than enough. 2 weeks passed without me stepping foot inside Julia's home. It wasn't because something was wrong. In fact, things between us had never felt more settled, more understood. We still messaged almost daily. Sometimes she'd send a picture of her garden in bloom, or a blurry photo of a cup of tea, with a caption like "rainy day therapy." Other times I'd text her about something as mundane as a hardware sale or a dog I saw wearing goggles on the street. But neither of us pushed for more. That space, that gentle distance, had become part of the rhythm. It was unspoken, but shared. We were learning to grow on our own, while still keeping each other in sight. It was a kind of closeness I hadn't known before. Not urgent or possessive, just present. One Thursday afternoon, after finishing up a fence repair job on the other side of town, I found myself driving without thinking, only to realize I had turned onto her street. I wasn't sure what I was doing there. I hadn't told her I was coming. When I saw her outside, kneeling by the lavender beds with a straw hat on and smudges of soil on her cheeks, I figured maybe some part of me had known she'd be there. She looked up, her face lighting up without hesitation. "I was hoping you'd show up today," she called, brushing her hands off on her pants. I could use some muscle with this stubborn root. I got out of the truck, grabbed my gloves from the passenger seat, and joined her without asking questions. That was how it was now. We didn't always need reasons. We just needed the moment. We worked in silence for a while, her humming something under her breath I couldn't quite place. I noticed how much fuller the garden had grown since I last saw it, how the marigolds were now bright enough to catch your eye from the sidewalk. The rosemary was thriving, and a few of the tomato plants had started showing early signs of fruit. It all looked alive, like it had been loved into flourishing. Like she had. Eventually, she stood up, stretching her arms above her head with a soft groan. "I'm starving," she said. "Stay for dinner?" I nodded, and she smiled, brushing her arm lightly against mine as we walked inside. That simple gesture, no performance, no pretext, was enough to send a small warmth fluttering through my chest. It was the kind of moment that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but it felt massive in its simplicity. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of garlic and onions, and she moved with the ease of someone who had cooked alone long enough to be unbothered by another set of hands in her space. I offered to chop vegetables while she stirred a pot on the stove. And before long, we had something hearty simmering between us. Nothing fancy, just real, warm food made together. She played music from her phone, some low acoustic playlist that filled the room like candlelight, and we talked about everything and nothing all at once. At one point, she told me she'd been writing in the journal I gave her, and that the pages were starting to fill. I didn't ask what she wrote. I just told her I was glad she was using it. We ate at the small dining table by the window, a place I'd never actually sat before. Usually our conversations happened standing at the counter or curled up in mismatched chairs. But tonight, there was something intentional about sitting across from each other like this dinner. This evening carried more weight. She poured wine into 2 glasses and raised hers slightly before taking a sip. "I've been thinking about something," she said, her tone light, but her eyes steady. "About that night you helped me paint the bedroom, when I told you I hadn't let anyone close in years." I set my fork down gently, giving her my full attention. She reached for her wine glass again, but didn't drink this time. "I wasn't just talking about physical touch," she said. "I mean, I know I said that, but it's more than that. It was about letting someone witness me. Letting someone see the parts I don't polish up." "You don't have to explain," I said softly. She shook her head. "I know, but I want to. 'Cause lately it feels like you've seen more of me than I've seen myself in a long time. And that's terrifying, but it's also kind of beautiful." A quiet passed between us, not uncomfortable, just full. I let her words settle before I answered. "I think we all get used to being invisible," I said. "Even when we're surrounded by people, especially when we are, actually. And then someone notices a thing, your laugh, or the way your voice softens when you talk about your garden, and suddenly you don't feel like a background character in your own life." She looked at me for a long time, and her lips curved into a small, trembling smile. "That's exactly it. I didn't know how much I missed being seen until you showed up and didn't look away. We didn't touch hands. We didn't lean." Across the table, there was a current in the air, thick with understanding and care, and something else we hadn't quite named yet, and that was enough. After dinner, we stood at the sink, washing dishes side by side like we had been doing, if for years. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue across the kitchen. I glanced over and saw her staring out the window, a softness in her features I hadn't seen before. She looked peaceful, not happy in the giddy sense, but content, grounded. She must have felt my gaze, because she turned toward me and said, "You know, I used to hate the silence in this house. It used to scream at me now. It hums. It sings sometimes." "I get that," I said. "Silence isn't the enemy, just needs the right company." We finished cleaning up and I stayed. A while longer, talking about books and places we'd never been but might want to visit someday. It wasn't planning, just dreaming out loud. Around 10, I stood to leave, and she walked me to the door. This time, she didn't just say goodbye. She stepped a little closer and rested her hand lightly on my chest, just over my heart. Her eyes searched mine, not with expectation, but with trust. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" I asked, my voice low. "For being kind. For staying. For not rushing. For showing up." I placed my hand gently over hers. "You don't have to thank me, I'm just glad I met you." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "So am I," and that was it. No grand declarations, no promises, just a moment, one of 1,000. Little ones that had begun stitching something real between us. I left that night feeling more like myself than I had in years. And maybe that was the real magic of Julia. She didn't just come back to life, she invited me to come alive too. There's something strange that happens when 2 people begin to heal side by side, not through a grand romantic gesture or some dramatic confession, but through the quiet, constant presence of each other. It happens in the way your breath evens out when you're near them, the way you start to look forward to mundane things just because they might be part of it. I didn't know how deeply Julia had become part of my daily rhythm until the morning. I woke up and instinctively reached for my phone to tell her something, only to stop halfway through typing because I realized she was already calling me. That kind of timing, that kind of synchronicity, it wasn't magic, but it felt a lot like it. She asked me if I was free to help her put up some shelves she'd ordered online. "They're not heavy," she said, "but I need a second pair of hands and someone who can stop me from hanging them crooked like last time." I laughed and told her I'd be over in an hour. When I arrived, the boxes were already unpacked, spread out on the living room floor with the instructions unfolded and flattened with a coffee mug. She had rearranged the furniture again, and I could see the plants in the window had multiplied. There was a calm domesticity to the space now, feeling that this wasn't just where she lived, where she belonged. As we measured and marked the walls, she chatted about her morning routine, how she had started meditating for 5 minutes. After waking up, just breathing and listening, I never thought silence could be so loud, until I stopped fearing it, she said. Now it's like the silence talks back, but gently. I understood exactly what she meant. There's a kind of clarity that comes only when the noise dies down, when your thoughts aren't racing to escape something, but finally settling into a rhythm. When we finished with the shelves, she stood back and tilted her head. "They're straight, right?" she asked. "Straight enough to look intentional," I teased, and she elbowed me lightly, her smile warm and unguarded. We ended up spending the rest of the afternoon reorganizing the books and framed photos she wanted to put on the shelves. She told me stories behind each photo. Her first apartment, a trip to Spain, a blurry picture of her and her younger brother on the beach. There was one photo she hesitated on, her fingers lingering at the edges. It was a picture of her and a man with kind eyes, taken during what looked like a winter trip. Her voice quieted as she said, "That was Aaron. We were together for almost a decade." I didn't press, but I didn't look away either. "He was kind," she said, "but he needed something I couldn't keep giving. I kept showing up half empty and pretending I was full. Eventually, we both got tired of the performance." I nodded, letting the weight of her honesty settle. "You ever feel like you outgrew a version of yourself you didn't even realize you'd outgrown?" she asked. "All the time," I said. "Sometimes I look back and barely recognize the man I was 5 years ago. But then again, I think that's part of the point." She smiled at that. Evolution without announcement. That evening she invited me to stay for dinner again. We made a simple stir-fry, laughing over a small kitchen disaster involving too much sesame oil. After we ate, we sat on the couch, her legs tucked under her and a blanket draped over both our laps. The conversation drifted into softer things, childhood memories, dreams that never quite made it off the ground, songs that still stirred something old and tender. And then, somewhere between the comfort and the quiet, she said it, I think. "I'm starting to want more," she whispered. My heart paused, not out of fear, but because I felt the weight of those words. They didn't come from restlessness or loneliness. They came from clarity. "More of what?" I asked, even though I already knew. "More of this, more connection, more days that feel like they're mine, and maybe more time with you." I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to say something just to fill the space. Instead, I looked at her looked hand, saw not the woman I met fixing a water heater, but someone who had climbed her way back from silence, who had chosen herself again and again, and who was now finally offering something not out of need, but out of abundance. "I want more too," I said, "but only if it keeps feeling like this, gentle, honest, and real." She exhaled a soft, relieved sound. "Yeah, no games, no rush, just real." We didn't kiss, didn't hold hands, just sat there, the blanket warm across our legs, our shoulders barely touching. But there was a certainty in the air, a quiet understanding that something had shifted, not in a way that demanded change, but in a way that invited it later. As I stood to leave, she walked me to the door as always. But this time, she stepped closer, stood on her toes, and pressed her forehead gently against my chest. Her hands rested on my arms, and I wrapped mine around her in return, not tightly, but firmly enough that she could feel she was held. "I'm glad you knocked on my door that day," she murmured. "I'm glad you answered," I said. She stepped back, her eyes soft and steady. "Drive safe." "Always," I replied, and as I walked back to my truck, I felt something bloom inside me, not the wild, uncontrollable bloom of infatuation, but the slow, deliberate kind. The kind that grows roots before it grows petals, kind you don't rush because you know it's meant to last. Julia wasn't a chapter. She was a season, and I had the distinct feeling that this one wasn't ending anytime soon. The days that followed were calm in the best way, like a quiet river after a long storm, Julia and I didn't talk every single day, but when we did, it never felt like catching up. It felt like picking up mid-thought. Sometimes she'd send me a photo of her garden at sunrise, or a voice note about something she read in a book that moved her. Other times, I'd send her a snapshot of something small and strange I saw on a job site, like a bird's nest tucked inside an outdoor fuse box, or a dog with a missing front tooth, and more personality than most people. We were slowly becoming part of each other's routines, without ever needing to say so out loud. It was seamless, unforced, like how you remember to water a plant not because it's wilting, but because you want it to thrive. Then one weekend, she invited me to go with her to the local farmer's market. It wasn't something I normally did crowds. Morning traffic, overpriced produce, but for some reason, I said yes, without hesitation. I met her at her house just after 8 a.m., and she greeted me with 2 travel mugs of coffee and a canvas tote bag she said I had to carry because she was not pulling a rotator cuff over rhubarb. She was wearing a simple sundress and sandals, her hair tied up, and the way she looked at me in that moment, with such easy comfort, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not the ache of longing, but the kind that comes when something feels so right it almost hurts to realize how long you've been without it. The farmer's market itself was bustling local vendors. Handmade soaps, wildflower bouquets, kids with sticky fingers and dogs on leashes. Julia seemed to know half the people there, stopping every few steps to greet someone, ask about their kids, compliment their earrings. Watching her move through that space so alive, so engaged, I realized how deeply she belonged here, and this life she had slowly built back up from the quiet. And I also realized how much I wanted to keep being part of that world, not just as a visitor, but as something steady, something she could reach for and know would always be there. We bought fresh herbs. Sometimes she'd send me a photo of her garden at sunrise, or a voice note about something she read in a book that moved her. Other times, I'd send her a snapshot of something small and strange I saw on a job site, like a bird's nest tucked inside an outdoor fuse box, or a dog with a missing front tooth, and more personality than most people. We were slowly becoming part of each other's routines, without ever needing to say so out loud. It was seamless, unforced, like how you remember to water a plant not because it's wilting, but because you want it to thrive. Then one weekend, she invited me to go with her to the local farmer's market. It wasn't something I normally did crowds. Morning traffic, overpriced produce, but for some reason, I said yes, without hesitation. I met her at her house just after 8 a.m., and she greeted me with 2 travel mugs of coffee and a canvas tote bag she said I had to carry because she was not pulling a rotator cuff over rhubarb. She was wearing a simple sundress and sandals, her hair tied up, and the way she looked at me in that moment, with such easy comfort, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not the ache of longing, but the kind that comes when something feels so right it almost hurts to realize how long you've been without it. The farmer's market itself was bustling local vendors. Handmade soaps, wildflower bouquets, kids with sticky fingers and dogs on leashes. Julia seemed to know half the people there, stopping every few steps to greet someone, ask about their kids, compliment their earrings. Watching her move through that space so alive, so engaged, I realized how deeply she belonged here, and this life she had slowly built back up from the quiet. And I also realized how much I wanted to keep being part of that world, not just as a visitor, but as something steady, something she could reach for and know would always be there. We bought fresh herbs, strawberries, and a loaf of rosemary bread that Julia insisted we eat with cheese that night. There was a booth selling handmade candles, and she picked up one labeled Evening Rain and made me smell it. It did, somehow, smell like the air just after a storm. "You like it?" she asked. I nodded. She bought it and handed it to me without another word. A gift without ceremony, just because. Afterwards, we sat under a shaded tree near the parking lot, sharing a small paper container of honey-coated almonds. She leaned her shoulder lightly against mine, and I let it stay there. Not because I thought it meant something big, but because it meant something simple. She was comfortable. Safe, she said after a while. It's still strange. To me, how someone can come into your life so quietly and then suddenly it's like they've always been there. I didn't respond right away. I was too caught up in the weight of that sentence. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't her asking me to promise anything. But it was the clearest truth we'd spoken in a long time. I feel the same, I said. Like I found something I didn't even know I was missing. Oh, she turned her face toward me, and the sunlight hit her eyes just right. Do you think that's what connection is? Not sparks or drama, but just being seen, being steady. Think it's that. Yeah, I said. I think real connection is quiet. It grows in the space where you don't have to perform. She smiled, and for a moment we just sat there, watching people pass by with their bags and baskets. The world continuing around us as if nothing had changed. Even though everything had. That night, we cooked dinner together at her place again. The strawberries became a lazy dessert with whipped cream. The herbs went into a lemony pasta dish she swore by, and the rosemary bread, still warm from the market, was sliced thick and shared in silence. We lit the candle she bought and let it fill the room with that strange, beautiful scent of evening rain. It was a small space, that kitchen, nothing fancy. But it felt like the center of something steady. After we cleaned up, we sat in the living room, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner and the flickering candle on the table. She pulled her legs up beneath her and looked at me with something deeper than affection in her eyes. "There's something I need to say," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't want you to feel like I'm asking for anything. I just need to say it out loud." I nodded, giving her the room. "When I told you I hadn't been touched in years, I think a part of me expected you to pull away. Not physically, but emotionally. People do that when they sense too much. ... Wait, but you didn't. You stayed. I realized ... It wasn't the absence of touch that hurt me. It was the absence of mattering." I swallowed hard. "Julia, you matter. You mattered before you said that. You mattered the moment you opened the door that day." She exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding that breath for years. I'm still learning how to let that be true. I reached across the small space between us and took her hand, not tightly, not possessively, but gently. Her fingers closed around mine slowly, like she was testing the weight of what that gesture meant. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Not unless you ask me to." She didn't speak, but her eyes filled with tears, not the kind born of pain, but of release. The kind that come when you've finally been seen for everything you are and nothing is asked of you in return. We sat there for a long time, our hands intertwined, the candle burning down slowly, the silence stretching into something sacred. That night I didn't sleep at her house. I didn't even suggest it. We weren't there, not yet. What we had was something else entirely. It wasn't about bodies. It wasn't even about romance. Not exactly. It was about presence, trust, reclamation. Two people learning slowly, and honestly, that closeness doesn't always come with fire. It can come with warmth, stillness, and the quiet certainty that you are not alone. And for now, that was more than enough. The days that followed slipped into something that resembled a rhythm. Not a routine exactly, but a pace, a slow, unhurried unfolding of moments that felt neither forced nor fabricated. Julia and I began to orbit one another in ways that didn't demand explanation. I might stop by with a bag of screws she mentioned she needed, or she'd drop off a loaf of banana bread with a note scribbled in looping cursive that read, "Thought you might need a reason." To take a break. There was no keeping score, no silent tally of who reached out first. It was reciprocal by nature, and that made all the difference. On a cloudy Tuesday, I finished up a repair job early and drove by her house, not entirely sure if I'd knock, or just pass by and keep going. But when I saw her on the porch in a soft gray sweater, wrapped in a shawl and sipping from a steaming mug, I parked without a second thought. She didn't seem surprised to see me. If anything, she looked like she had been waiting, not anxiously, peacefully, like someone who expected the tide to return eventually. She lifted the mug slightly. "Chamomile," she said. "Want some?" I nodded and followed her inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender and lemon, and a new stack of books sat on the coffee table. The candle she'd bought still sat near the sink, almost burned halfway down now. Felt like nothing had changed since I was last there, and yet everything somehow had. The comfort was deeper, the pauses more natural, the warmth in the air more deliberate. She poured me a cup, and we sat in the living room, our mugs warming our hands. Outside, the sky threatened rain, the kind that comes without warning and lingers just long enough to remind you that change can be both sudden and beautiful. I watched her tuck her feet beneath her and adjust the blanket draped over her legs. She looked content. It's like a... That night, for the first time, I didn't leave right away. We watched an old movie on her tiny television, something black and white, with soft music and gentle dialogue. About halfway through, she leaned against me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder, and I shifted just enough to wrap my arm around her. We stayed like that, quiet, steady, breathing in time with the rain and each other. At the end of the movie, neither of us moved. The credits rolled in silence, and the only sound in the room was the rain outside. Eventually she whispered, "I'm not used to this." "To what?" I asked, my voice low. "This feeling safe, feeling cared for without having to earn it." I squeezed her gently. "You don't have to earn anything with me. Just being you is enough." She didn't respond right away, but I felt the way her body softened against mine. That was answer enough. When the storm finally began to fade, I stood to leave. Meet at the door like always, but this time, her hand lingered on the doorknob as if she wasn't quite ready to say goodnight. I turned to face her. She looked up at me with something in her eyes I couldn't quite name, but I felt it. "I think I've spent most of my life building walls," she said softly. "And now, with you, I'm learning how to let someone walk through the door without knocking it down." I stepped closer, just enough to feel her breath on my collarbone. "Then let's keep the door open," I said. "No need to rush in, no need to slam it shut, just open enough for something real to pass through." She smiled, then tired, grateful, steady. "Good night, Roman. Good night, Julia." I walked back to my truck under a sky still dripping. With leftover rain, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was walking with something, carrying it with me, wherever this road might go. The morning after the rain, everything felt freshly washed, as if even the air had been scrubbed clean. I opened my truck door and paused for a moment, letting the cool, damp breeze hit my face. It reminded me of the night before, of Julia's voice in the dark, of how her head felt resting on my shoulder, of that invisible thread between us tightening, gently but certainly. I didn't need to dissect it, didn't need to label it, or hold it under a microscope. I just needed to let it keep pulling me toward her, one quiet day at a time. Work that day was slow. One of those jobs where you're mostly waiting for paint to dry or for a delivery to arrive. I didn't mind. It gave me space to think, though I noticed lately my thoughts had begun orbiting one person more than anything else. I thought about the things she said, the way she said them. I thought about the quiet strength in her vulnerability, the way she had shared herself without expectation, like placing a fragile object in my hands and trusting me not to drop it. I knew I wanted to protect that trust. I also knew I didn't want to rush it. That evening I didn't plan to see her. We hadn't made any arrangements, and I figured after such an intimate evening, it would be good to give her some breathing room. But around 6:30, my phone buzzed with a message that simply read, "Can I borrow your strong arms again?" I bought a bench. I chuckled, grabbed my keys, and replied, "On my way." When I arrived, the bench was still in its box, lying across her hallway floor. She looked sheepish as she opened the door. "I may have underestimated the size," she admitted. "I may have overestimated your restraint." I teased, and she laughed, stepping aside to let me in. We spent the next hour assembling the bench in her entryway. It was a sleek wooden piece, functional but stylish, with a little storage shelf beneath it. She wanted it near the front door for putting on shoes and dropping keys like a responsible adult, she said. But I knew it was more than that. Julia was claiming her space, one piece at a time. She was building a life that looked like her, and I got to help, piece by piece. As we tightened the final screws, she sat down on the bench with a satisfied sigh. She said, I used to dread assembling furniture. It always reminded me I was alone, and now it feels like proof I'm not, she said, and patted the spot beside her. I sat. We didn't speak for a while. There was no need. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was soft, like the kind of pause a musician takes before the next verse, knowing the audience is still with them. After a few minutes, she turned slightly and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," I said, knowing whatever she asked would come from a place of honesty, not intrusion. "Have you ever been in love?" She asked not with jealousy or expectation, but with genuine curiosity. I thought about it, not about how to answer, but about the truth itself. "I thought I was once," I said. "But looking back, I think I was in love with the idea of being needed, not with the person herself." She nodded slowly. "That kind of love can be exhausting." "It was," I said, and confusing, because I kept thinking love meant doing more, giving more, being more. What? But the more I gave, the less of myself I had left. Julia looked down at her hands in her lap. "That sounds familiar," she murmured. "I gave years of my life to someone who loved how I made them feel, but not who I really was. I kept shrinking myself to fit their needs, thinking that was loyalty." I looked at her, really looked. She was the kind of woman who had depth behind her eyes, who had lived long enough to stop pretending, who carried her scars like quiet stories. And in that moment, I realized something simple and true. I respected her, not just admired, not just liked. I respected who she was, what she had survived, how she had chosen to grow instead of wither. I think that's why this, I said. Gesturing between us feels different. There's no performance here, no audience. It's just two people learning to sit in their own truth. She smiled, and I could see the emotion welling in her eyes, though she didn't let the tears fall. "Not this time. I used to believe I had to be healed before I could be loved," she said. "But maybe healing comes with being loved." Not. Instead of it, I didn't respond right away. Some moments deserve space. And besides, her words were true enough to echo. Eventually, we moved into the kitchen, made tea. I dried the dishes from lunch she hadn't put away. We moved around each other with ease, like we'd done it for years. When the tea was ready, we brought it out to the porch. The rain had stopped completely, but the air still held that post-storm sweetness. The sky was bruised with the first colors of twilight, dusty purples and smudges of orange fading behind the trees as we sipped. She leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, I used to hate evenings. They made me feel ... lonely. Like everyone else was winding down with someone, and I was just sitting with shadows. And now?" I asked. She looked at me with a kind of gentle certainty I wasn't expecting now. "I think evenings are when I feel the most hopeful," she said, "because they remind me the day isn't over. Still time, still room for something good." I reached across and rested my hand over hers. Not to make a move, not to start something physical, just to anchor her to the moment, to say, "I'm here," without saying it aloud. She squeezed back. We sat like that for a long time, till the stars began to peek through the clouds, and the world turned quieter. And in that silence, I thought about how some of the best love stories aren't built on fireworks or sweeping gestures, but on small, steady things. A shared cup of tea, a rebuilt water heater, a bench in an entryway. The gentle unfolding of two people learning to hold space for one another without asking for more than the other is ready to give. And for the first time in years, I wasn't wondering what came next. I was just grateful for exactly where I was. The following morning felt different. Not because anything dramatic had happened the night before, but because of everything that didn't. There was no kiss, no passionate confession, no grand declaration. Yet I woke up with the calm certainty that something had shifted between Julia and me. It was as if we had both made a quiet promise in the spaces between words and touch to keep showing up for each other. Slowly, honestly, without rushing what didn't need to be rushed. I spent the day on a small job just outside town replacing warped floorboards in an elderly woman's sunroom. This was the kind of work I liked best. Tedious, careful, but deeply satisfying. As I knelt there with my tools spread out beside me and sunlight streaming through the dusty windows, I found myself thinking about Julia, not in the way I had before. Not in flashes of her smile or the sound of her laugh, but in a fuller way. I thought about what her mornings looked like, the way she filled her hours with purpose. I wondered what she was reading that day, what song might be playing in her kitchen as she brewed her second cup of tea. I thought about her porch, her garden, her laugh when it caught her off guard. These weren't the idle thoughts of a crush. They were the thoughts of someone letting someone else take root inside them, quietly, without resistance. At lunch, I stepped outside and checked my phone. She'd sent a picture of the newly assembled bench, now topped with a cushion and a folded blanket. Her caption simply read, "Looks lived in already." I smiled and replied with a thumbs up and a comment about how good she was at making everything feel like home. Later that evening, just as I was finishing up the job, she called. I was surprised Julia wasn't one to make spontaneous calls. We usually texted or planned things a few hours in advance. But there was something unguarded in her voice that made me stop packing my tools. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "Of course," I said, stepping outside and leaning against the truck. "I was going through some old boxes in the attic," she said, "and I found something. It kind of ... knocked the wind out of me." I waited, letting her speak on her own terms. "It was a letter I wrote to myself," she continued, "from 5 years ago, right after my divorce. I don't even remember writing it, but it was folded up with some old photos. In it, I made a list of all the things I thought I'd never feel again." Her voice cracked a little. "Not from tears exactly, but from memory. I wrote that I'd probably never be wanted again. Not really, not the way a woman wants to be seen. I wrote that no one would ever call me beautiful in the morning light, that no one would ever touch me like I mattered, and ... I believed it for a long time. I closed my eyes, the ache in my chest deepening, not out of pity, but out of sheer admiration, because here she was, speaking those words aloud, not as someone still buried under them, but as someone who had climbed her way out. "And now," I asked gently. "Now I know I was wrong," she said, "because I feel wanted, I feel beautiful, I feel like I matter." I didn't need to ask if I had anything to do with that. I already knew the answer. But what mattered more was that she said it for herself, not for my benefit. "Julia," he said quietly, "you've always mattered. The world just didn't always do a good job of showing you that." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that only happens when something true lands softly. "Would you maybe want to come by?" she asked. "I don't want to sit with these memories alone tonight. I was already getting into the truck. I'm on my way." I arrived. The house was dimly lit, a few candles flickering in the living room. She met me at the door barefoot, in a loose cardigan and old jeans. Her face looked softer somehow, as if unburdened by the act of remembering. She led me inside and showed me the letter. I didn't read it not because I didn't care, but because it wasn't mine to read unless she wanted me to. Instead, I sat beside her on the couch and we talked. Not about the past, but about what it had taught us. She told me stories she hadn't shared before about the loneliness that didn't go away when the papers were signed. About the nights she slept with a pillow down the middle of the bed just to remind herself not to reach for someone who was no longer there, and I listened. That's all she needed. Someone to sit with her in the space between who she had been and who she was becoming. Eventually, the conversation slowed. We sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was full. She leaned into me, her head finding its place just beneath my chin, and I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I don't know what this is turning into," murmured, her voice muffled against my chest. "But I like it." "Me too," I whispered. "And we don't have to define it yet. We can just let it grow." Shh. She looked up at me then, her face barely lit by candlelight, when for the first time since we met, she kissed me, softly, without urgency, without expectation. It wasn't the kind of kiss that tried to make up for lost time. It was the kind that said, "We have time now." When she pulled back, she didn't apologize. She didn't look away. She just held my gaze and smiled as if to say, "Finally, we stayed." Like that for a long time. No rush. No pressure. Just a shared understanding that something real was beginning, something worth protecting. And as I sat there with her, the letter resting on the table nearby and the night curling around us like a warm blanket. I realized something simple and profound. Healing doesn't always look like closure. Sometimes it looks like opening. Slowly, carefully, with someone who knows how to hold you without asking you to be fixed. The days that followed felt lighter. Not because everything had suddenly clicked into place, or because we had uttered any kind of commitment, but because there was something unmistakably mutual between us now. That kiss, quiet and unrushed, had said more than any long conversation could. It had whispered trust, vulnerability, and above all, permission. Permission to keep exploring. Whatever it was we had found in each other without trying to force it into a shape before it was ready. Maybe that was what made it so comforting. The absence of pressure. I kept working through my list of repair jobs in town. Life didn't stop just because my heart was slowly waking up to someone new. But I noticed that everything I did seemed to carry a different kind of weight now, not heavy, but more grounded. I found myself paying closer attention to the way sunlight hit old wooden floors. The way a client's voice changed when they talked about something they loved. The way even mundane tasks felt sacred when done with care. Maybe Julia had something to do with that. Maybe love, or the quiet hope of ITH has a way of sharpening your senses instead of dulling them. Julia. And I didn't see each other every day, but we checked in constantly. She'd send a photo of a painting she was working on, asking if the sky looked pink. I'd reply with a selfie of me covered in sawdust and ask if I looked rugged or just plain filthy. She'd laugh. I'd smile at her laughter. And in between those silly exchanges, we started weaving something stronger. The kind of connection built on noticing, on paying attention, on truly seeing each other. One evening, I invited her over for dinner. Not a fancy one, just something home-cooked and warm. I made roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, a recipe my grandmother used to swear by. Julia arrived in a sundress and denim jacket, her hair loosely pulled back and her eyes bright with curiosity. She brought a bottle of wine and a book of poetry. Tucked under her arm, "This is payment for the meal," she said, handing me the book with a grin. "You cook. I'll read to you after." It was the most natural evening I'd had in years. We ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing, and then moved to the couch where she opened the book and began reading. Her voice calm, steady, musical filled the room with rhythm and softness. At one point, she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. "You always listen like you've never heard anything more important," she said. "I do," I replied, "'cause it is." She blushed and tucked her feet under her, continuing with the next poem. I leaned back, letting the sound of her voice wrap around me, and I realized how deeply I had come to crave her presence, not as a distraction or a romantic conquest, but as something grounding, steady, real. That night, she stayed longer than usual. We washed the dishes together in companionable silence. At one point, her hand brushed against mine beneath the soapy water. We both paused, smiling to ourselves without needing to speak. As I walked her to the door, there was no lingering awkwardness, no guessing about whether or not she'd lean in again. She kissed me softly, confidently, and said, "Thank you for the quiet." After she left, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the night settle in. There was a fullness in my chest I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't adrenaline or lust or the excitement of newness. It was something older, slower, and far more enduring. It was peace. A few days later, Julia texted me something different, less playful, more urgent. "Hey, any chance you can stop? By later, something's on my mind. Nothing bad, just would love to see you." I finished up a quick repair job and drove over without hesitation. When she opened the door, she was barefoot, hair slightly damp like she'd just showered, and her expression was unreadable thoughtful, maybe a little hesitant. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. She led me into the living room, where 2 mugs of tea were already waiting. On the table was a folder filled with old photographs, some curling at the corners. I recognized Julia in a few her younger self, with sharper cheekbones and longer hair. Always standing beside a man I didn't recognize. "That's Mark," she said, pointing to the man. My ex-husband. I nodded slowly, waiting. Been thinking, she began, choosing her words carefully, that maybe the reason I kept those photos so close wasn't because I couldn't let go of him. It's because I hadn't yet accepted that I was allowed to move forward. She looked up at me then, her eyes clear. I'm ready now. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't need to. I reached across the table and took her hand in mine, holding it firmly. She smiled, more to herself than to me, and slowly started removing the photographs from the folder. Some she set aside to keep. Others she put in a small paper bag labeled, "Donate." The act was quiet but powerful, like pruning a tree so it could grow better in spring. Afterwards, we sat on the porch again, wrapped in an old quilt she brought out from the linen closet. The stars were just beginning to blink. Into view, and the air held the first whisper of summer. I told her about a cabin I'd once stayed at in the mountains, about how peaceful it was to wake up with the sun pouring through pine trees and nothing but bird song to mark the time. "We should go," she said suddenly. "You and me. It's just for a weekend. No phones, no plans, just the sound of trees." Her suggestion caught me off guard, but not in a bad way. I liked the way she said we, like it was a given now, not a question. And I realized I wanted that too. A weekend without noise. It's just her and me, and the quiet that had come to mean more than any grand adventure ever could. "I'd love that," I said. "We'll pick a weekend soon." We sat there until the night wrapped fully around us, until her head found its place on my shoulder again, and my arm instinctively pulled her closer. We didn't say much after that, because what needed to be said had already been shared in the small, steady acts of choosing each other again and again. And somewhere in the hush of that evening, as the crickets began to sing and the world turned slowly beneath our feet, I realized something else. Love doesn't always enter loudly. Sometimes it's the gentlest thing in the room, the one you almost didn't notice until it was right beside you. Warm and undeniable. That weekend, we didn't make it to the mountains. Not yet. Life had its own way of pulling us back to the present. Julia had a gallery meeting. I had a client whose bathroom remodel turned into something closer to a full-blown emergency. And suddenly, the days filled up faster than either of us could manage. But the idea of the cabin, the trees, the silence, it lingered between us like a promise not yet spoken aloud. Even in the chaos of our separate days, I felt it. We were still moving forward. Even if the pace wasn't fast, I spent the next few evenings working longer hours, trying to finish a few overdue jobs to clear time for a break. Each night, when I'd finally collapse into bed, there'd be a message from Julia, usually something simple. Photo of her cat perched on her latest painting, or a blurry image of her dinner plate with the caption, "Too much garlic." When we weren't together, she made the space between us feel warm. One night, past 11, she called instead of texting. Her voice was softer than usual, as if she were already lying in bed, talking through shadows. She told me about an older couple she'd met that day at her gallery. Two people in their 70s who still held hands like teenagers. They'd stood in front of one of her abstract pieces and said it reminded them of falling in love all over again after 50 years. I asked them their secret, she said, her voice drifting. "And you know what the woman told me?" she said. "We just never stopped choosing each other, even when it got hard." She went quiet for a moment. I heard the faint rustle of her blanket. "I think that's what scares me the most," she admitted. "Not being chosen once, but being forgotten later." I didn't respond immediately. I let the weight of her words settle, because they deserved more than an eager comfort. And when I finally spoke, I made sure it came from the deepest place in me. "You won't be forgotten," I said. "Not by me. I don't think I could forget you if I tried." There was silence on the other end, but I could feel the shift, even without seeing her. The kind of shift where fear loosens just a little, because truth stepped in and sat down beside it. The next day, finished my last major job, and found myself with an open afternoon. On impulse, I drove to the local farmer's market and picked up ingredients. Julia had once mentioned loving figs, rosemary, some kind of goat cheese with herbs that I couldn't pronounce but knew she'd smile at. Then I headed to her place. Texting her only once I was outside, She opened the door in an oversized flannel shirt, her hair in a loose bun, a smudge of paint on her cheek. She blinked at me like she'd been lost in another world and was just, "Now returning." "I brought dinner," I said, holding up the bag. She stepped aside with a smile. "You're a dangerous man, Roman, showing up unannounced with figs and cheese." We cooked together in her kitchen, music playing low in the background. I chopped while she stirred. At one point, I looked up and found her just watching me, eyes soft. "What?" I asked. She shook her head, then said quietly, "I'm not used to this." "Used to what?" "To someone showing up for me? For no reason except wanting to?" I didn't respond with words. Instead, I reached out and tucked that smudge of paint off her cheek with my thumb, letting my fingers linger. Then we went back to cooking like it was the most natural thing in the world. Later, as we sat on her porch under a sky blooming with stars, Julia leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I've stopped counting how long it's been. Since what? Since I've felt this calm. Since I've let someone in this far." I wrapped an arm around her, drawing her closer, and in that stillness, something settled between us. Not in a dramatic, world-shifting way, but in the quiet confidence of two people who knew they were safe in each other's orbit. That night, I didn't leave. She didn't ask me to stay. It just sort of happened. One moment we were finishing tea, the next I was brushing my teeth with a spare toothbrush she'd handed me like it had always been there. We climbed into bed, fully clothed, side by side. Under her well-worn quilt, her cat took the spot between us like some kind of furry chaperone. And we fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping the windows again. When morning came, we didn't rush. We lay there, lazily wrapped in the warmth of waking beside someone who made the day feel softer. Julia turned to me, her hair a mess, her voice scratchy with sleep, and said, "I never thought mornings could feel this good again." I smiled, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Neither did I. I didn't say I love you, not yet. But it was in the way she poured my coffee first, in the way I reached for her hand without thinking, in the silence that no longer felt empty. Love was growing, not rushed, not dramatic, but steady. And I knew deep in my bones that I wasn't just helping her heal. She was healing me too. The following week passed like the kind you wish you could bottle, unremarkable to anyone else, but rich in the quiet, ordinary ways that matter most. There were no declarations, no sweeping gestures, just a rhythm we slipped into like it had been waiting for us. I'd drop by Julia's in the evenings, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just myself. We'd cook or read or sit in silence with music playing low. I fixed the squeaky hinge on her back gate, and she replaced the chipped mug I always used with one she found at a thrift store that had arched into the side. We didn't talk about what we were becoming. We just let it happen. One night, as we sat on her porch watching a distant thunderstorm flicker over the horizon, she asked me something unexpected. "What were you like before this?" she said, her voice soft and low. "Before all of this, before me, before this quiet version of you." I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, thinking, "I think I was restless," I said, "always moving. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to stop. Fixing things for people felt like control. I could hold chaos back if I just kept my hands busy." "And now?" she asked. "Now?" I looked over at her. "Now I feel like I can be still, not because everything's perfect, but because I'm not afraid of stillness anymore." She reached out and touched my hand, lacing her fingers with mine. "I used to fill my days with projects," she said. "Painting, organizing, even rearranging furniture. I didn't care about just to avoid the silence. It felt too loud, but lately, it started to feel safe. Like maybe silence can be company too." It struck me then that we were both healing from the same kind of loneliness, just shaped differently by time. Hers had come after being left. Mine, after never really being chosen. Out. And in each other, we weren't just finding comfort. We were rewriting the parts of ourselves that had forgotten what it meant to feel known. A few days later, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at an old photo of my younger self, me and my dad standing beside a broken-down truck. I'd helped him rebuild. He had his hand on my shoulder, pride on his face. It was the last summer before he passed. I hadn't thought about that summer in years. But lately, something about Julia had been pulling old memories to the surface memories I hadn't made peace with. That night I brought the photo with me to her place. When she asked why I looked a little far off, I handed it to her without saying anything. She studied it, then looked at me. "You were close." "Yeah," I said. "He taught me everything. Tools, patience, how to listen more than I speak." After he died, I think I started trying to fix things not because I liked it, but because it was the only way I knew how to keep him close. She didn't say anything right away, just placed the photo on her lap and rested her hand over mine. "You're not just fixing things anymore," she said gently. "You're building something." And with those words, I felt something settle inside me, a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. Julia had this way of saying the thing I didn't know I needed to hear until she said it, later that week. We finally made it to the mountains. It wasn't the original cabin I had told her about, but it was something better, a modest rental tucked away in the pines, with creaky floorboards and a wood-burning stove. The air smelled of moss and bark, and the silence was a living thing, thick and full. We spent the first day hiking until our legs ached, stopping to pick wild berries and photograph moss-covered rocks. That night, wrapped in a blanket on the porch, we watched the sky stretch wider than either of us remembered it being. "I wish I'd done this sooner," she said. "Gone away, gotten quiet." I looked at her and smiled. "You did it exactly when you were ready. We spent the weekend like that, unplugged, unhurried, undistracted, cooked on a tiny stovetop, read books out loud, danced barefoot to music on my phone with the volume turned low. And on the last night, as we lay beneath a sky so crowded with stars it barely looked real, she turned to me and said something I hadn't expected yet, somehow always knew was coming. "I think I love you," she whispered.
That
Way. Not in the fireworks and symphonies way, but in the "I'd use you again tomorrow" kind of way. I turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I've been loving you quietly for weeks now," I said. "I just didn't know how to say it without breaking the spell." Her eyes shimmered in the dark, and for a long time we just held each other beneath the stars. No need for more words, no need for answers. Just two people finally seeing what had been growing between them all along. When we returned from the mountains, something had shifted, not in a dramatic, cinematic kind of way, but in the small, steady beats of daily life. The kind you only notice if you're paying attention. We no longer danced around what we were. The unspoken questions, the quiet second-guessing, all seemed to fall away somewhere on that forest trail, or maybe between the pages of the book we passed back and forth at night. We came home not as two people exploring the idea of connection, but as two people who had found something worth keeping, worth building around. Still no titles, no rushed plans. Just presence, commitment in the simplest form, staying. The days unfolded with a comforting rhythm. Julia spent more time painting in the sunroom, her work evolving in color and texture. I could tell by the way she stood back from her canvases, hands on hips, head tilted, that she was opening herself up again, not just creatively, but emotionally. There was more light in her work, more vulnerability in the lines. One afternoon I walked in to find her crying in front of one of her larger pieces, not out of sadness, but because, as she put it, "It's the first thing I've painted that feels like me, not just something I was trying to make beautiful." I didn't say anything. She just wrapped my arms around her from behind and let her lean into me until the tears softened into laughter. Work was steady for me. I found myself turning down a few weekend jobs, something I hadn't done in years. My clients understood, most of them had known me long enough to recognize the look in my eyes had changed. A few even joked about it. One woman, who's deck-eyed. "Been refinishing for years," said whoever she is. "Roman, tell her thank you for softening your edges. You used to move like you were running from something. Now you move like you're walking toward it." I did tell Julia later that night, and she smiled, then asked if I wanted to take a weekend trip to the coast soon, just because. We did. At the beach, I watched her collect tiny stones and bits of glass, running her fingers through sand like she was sifting memories. She told me stories from her childhood, one about a seashell she'd kept hidden under her pillow for years, convinced it whispered secrets if she pressed her ear to it long enough. I told her about my first heartbreak, how it came not from a girl, but from realizing my mother was more fragile than I thought. We traded pieces of ourselves like that, enwrapping old wounds without flinching, holding each other's truths like they were precious and deserving of care. When we got back, her place didn't feel like hers anymore. It felt like ours. My toothbrush was always in the same cup by her sink. My boots sat beside hers by the door. A jacket I'd left one chilly evening never made it back to my truck. It hung by the entryway, waiting for me like she did, quietly and without demand. We still had our own spaces, our own routines, but we moved around each other like puzzle pieces now, fitting without needing to force anything. One night, maybe a month after that trip, I came home from a long job, something involving rewiring. An old cabin for a retired couple who insisted on feeding me way too much pie. I walked into her house to find it filled with the smell of ginger and something else I couldn't quite name. She was in the kitchen wearing that same oversized flannel shirt, barefoot, music humming from her phone. When she saw me, she didn't speak. She just smiled and kept stirring the pot on the stove. I walked up behind her, wrapped my arms around her waist, and rested my chin on her shoulder. In that quiet, I realized we were no longer falling in love. We were already there. Later that night, after dinner, we sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by old photographs and half-packed boxers. Julia had decided to clear out the storage closets, something she'd avoided for years. Inside were things she hadn't touched since before her divorce. Forgotten artwork, old travel journals, notes from past students, love letters she hadn't had the courage to throw away. We sifted through them together, slowly, like archaeologists, unearthing layers of a former life. At one point, she pulled out a folded note and handed it to me. "I never sent this," she said. "It was for someone I thought I loved. But looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of being loved than the person himself." I read the note. It was beautiful, vulnerable, poetic, full of longing. "You don't have to be ashamed of this," I said. "It means you." Tried. She took it back gently, tore it once, then again, and tossed the pieces into the trash bin beside us. "I'm not ashamed," she said. "I just don't need to carry it anymore." That moment hit me hard. How many things had I been carrying quietly and without even noticing? Regrets, expectations, people I'd tried to prove myself to who were long gone. That night, after she fell asleep, I went home and did the same, pulled out the old shoebox of letters, ticket stubs, and snapshots that I'd stuffed in the back of my closet for over a decade. Some I kept, most I let go. And I didn't do it because I needed closure. I did it because I was finally ready for the life I was building now. With her one morning, weeks later, we were sipping coffee on the porch when she turned to me and asked, "Do you ever think about moving in together?" It wasn't a question laced with pressure. It was curiosity, hope, and trust all wrapped up in 7 small words. I set down my mug, looked her straight in the eyes and said, "I already feel like I live here. But yeah, I think about it." She smiled and leaned her head on my shoulder. "Good," she said. Made space in the closet. The morning that marked exactly 6 months since I'd first knocked on, Julia's door to fix her water heater started the same as most others. Slow, quiet, and full of the kind of ease that made you forget there had ever been a time when the silence between us wasn't comfortable. I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of distant jazz humming from the old Bluetooth speaker she kept in the kitchen. Her cat was curled at my feet, tail twitching in his sleep, and the sun coming in through the windows painted soft gold across the hardwood floor. These small moments, forgettable in the blur of busy days, had become sacred. I found her, barefoot in the kitchen, hair tousled, wearing that same robe with the frayed sleeve that she refused to part with. She was humming to herself, lost in her own rhythm, as she poured coffee into 2 mugs, one of which had my name scribbled in black marker across the side. When she noticed me, her face lit up with a smile that still caught me off guard in the best way. "Morning," she said, handing me my mug. I leaned down, kissed her on the cheek, and took it from her with a quiet thanks. There was something about the way she smelled coffee, lavender, and oil paints that made the whole place feel more alive. We spent the morning in tandem, her sketching by the window, me on the porch fixing a loose shutter. By noon, we'd both settled into our usual Sunday routine: a late brunch, a walk to the farmer's market, and then back home to let the afternoon stretch lazily before us. It was nothing extravagant, but it felt more meaningful than anything I'd done in years. It wasn't just about what we were doing, but about the way we did it together, with intention, without rush. That afternoon, while we were reorganizing a few things in the guest room, mostly to make space for a new easel she'd ordered, I found a small cardboard box shoved into the back of the closet. It was unmarked, taped loosely, and covered in a fine layer of dust. Curious, I pulled it out and called to her. "Jules, what's this?" She came over, knelt beside me, and tilted her head. "Oh, wow. I haven't seen that in years." Inside were old Polaroids, ticket stubs, letters she'd written but never sent, and a few crumpled sketches from what looked like her early 20s. She sifted through them with a soft smile, fingers trailing over the edges like she was touching pieces of an old life she hadn't expected to see again. "I used to keep this box in my studio," she said. "Back when I thought everything I made had to be good. This was where I put the messy things. The raw things." I pulled out one of the sketches of figure study, loose and emotional, the lines unfinished, but bursting with energy. "This is good," I said. "It's real." She replied, "That's why I kept it." We spent the next hour going through that box, and it felt like peeling back layers of who she was before pain had made her cautious. She told me stories of her first art show in a cramped downtown space, of the apartment she used to share with two other artists who taught her how to stretch her own canvases, of the time she nearly gave up painting altogether because a critic said her work lacked focus. "That one hurt," she admitted. "But now I think maybe I was never meant to focus. Maybe I was meant to feel." It reminded me of something I hadn't shared before, so I told her. About the time I nearly walked away from the trade when a client yelled at me for ruining a backsplash, and I started to believe I wasn't cut out for building anything. How I spent weeks convincing myself I was only good for temporary fixes, not lasting solutions. She took my hand, squeezed it, and said, "You built something lasting right here, Roman, and it's beautiful." That evening, we sat on the porch again, wine in hand, watching the neighborhood quiet down. The sky was streaked with purple and soft orange, and the crickets had started their slow evening song. Julia leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a long time we didn't speak. We didn't need to. Eventually, she looked up at me with a kind of playful seriousness in her eyes and said, "You know, the water heater's been working perfectly since the day you fixed it." I chuckled. That's kind of my thing. She shifted, setting her wine glass down, and took both my hands in hers. 6 months ago. "I told you I hadn't been touched in years," she said quietly. And I meant it in every sense of the word, not just physically, but emotionally. I'd built walls so high, I forgot there was anything on the other side. I thought I was done being known. I squeezed her hands, feeling the warmth of them, the tremble just under the surface. "And now?" I asked. "Now I know it's possible again. Not just to be touched, but to be chosen, to be seen and loved as I am. I didn't think I'd get that at 48. But here we are." I felt something rise in my chest, a mix of gratitude and something that felt like home. "I didn't think I'd find this either," I said, "but I'm glad I was wrong." She leaned in, and we kissed not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of two people who had walked through their own storms and finally found shelter in each other. That night, lying in bed, I watched her sleep for a while. Her breathing was steady, her face peaceful, and I realized how far we'd both come, from strangers fumbling through awkward first conversations to this steady love. This earned comfort, this beautifully flawed and perfectly timed connection. Maybe love doesn't always arrive when you're young and ready and wide open. Sometimes it finds you when you're healing, when you least expect it, when you've stopped looking and started living. And maybe that's when it means the most, when it's a choice. It's not just a feeling. And as I closed my eyes, drifting off beside her, I thought, if all I ever do from this point forward is make her feel seen held, and understood. Then I'll consider this the best thing I've ever built. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.